Hello, everyone. Welcome to Life Edge, because life just doesn't have to be mediocre. I am joined today by Dr. Susan Nash, who we were just talking about SpaceX and going to space. And she saw, well, we'll show you later what she saw, because she thought it was cool. Anyway, Susan, how are you today?
I'm great, and I'm ready and willing to go to Mars.
Oh, to Mars. Oh, no. Okay. Well, at least you're not going to Pluto. It's a long flight. And I heard the peanuts really aren't that good on it. Here's our intro. And we are back. Well, Dr. Susan, it is time for another great guest. And you know
Absolutely.
A lot of great people. So I share in your knowledge of people, and it's fun. Do you want to introduce our guest today?
Happy to do so. Thrilled to introduce Rob Reynolds. And okay, so I'll give more information. Rob and I have known each other for more than 10 years, and he's a great guy. We met each other in conjunction with e-learning. So anyway, I thought that I would let Rob describe some of his passion for e-learning.
Hi, Rob.
Yeah. Hey, greetings, everybody, and I'm happy to share some of my passion, as Susan says. And Susan and I go back a little ways. We first met at the University of Oklahoma, and we're both instrumental in our own ways in helping move that university into online learning. I've also worked in publishing, been an entrepreneur, a startup entrepreneur, and in the educational technology space. I think it started for me early on around teaching languages, but then moving beyond that and understanding that we really live in this connected world and trying to understand how learning could scale to where it was more of a network rather than just it was more of a network rather than just a static classroom. And I saw the internet as a real opportunity to experiment with that. And I was lucky enough along the way to meet people like Susan and to kind of keep expanding that dialogue and those thoughts and watching what people like her were doing. And the journey continues. It's been really exciting. We're really at the forefront. It's not very often in any industry you get to be at the very beginning of the exploration. And Susan and I have been lucky enough to be right on the edge of watching online learning happen and being some of the very earliest practitioners, then watching it begin to build and and become what it can be. But we're still at the very forefront, in the first wave, as it were. And so it's still incredibly exciting, whether you're in it for the pedagogy, the technology, or whatever. It's just a great place to be in, and it's a really great place if you're passionate about learning and making a difference in the lives of learners, of teachers, and other people.
Well, one of the things that you say on your website, which is not interesting, it's so commonsensical, and yet it's not really done, is how learning by being connected makes such a difference, because it is how we learn.
Right. And it's one of those funny things. Most of the constructs that we've built around learning, not just in the United States, but historically, are rather artificial. So if you think about it, we create these artificial structures and we send people to them in artificial locations at artificial times, and we say that learning will happen at this designated interval that's arbitrary, and that's what learning is. Oh, and we'll put a individual person in charge of dispensing that knowledge. And so students are isolated, the experience is artificial, and it's rather arbitrary. And it doesn't take advantage of any of the natural flows or currencies that happen in real learning and natural learning, which is by nature communal. It's interacting with other people, and it's collaborative. And so as we've gone back, both from a technology and a learning design perspective, we've really looked at that and says, well, how do you design learning that is more natural, and how do you build technology and collaboration around that?
And it's very interesting because what happens is, as children, we're put in front of, like you said, a teacher who drones on and on usually, and for very long classes, and then you're done and you get the next teacher or the same teacher. Usually in elementary school, you tend to get the same one for sometimes 4 to 6 periods or more. And it's mind-numbing sometimes. Unless you get someone who's really good, the chances of that are pretty slim. And then as we grow, we go into the college system where, again, there's a lot of talking, very little facilitating, and there's no real communication between students more often than not.
That's exactly right. We've designed an entire system where there's this, I don't know if it's a belief, but it's a reality that learning ends at the end of a term. That somehow learning is something that happens in this multiple week period or a year-long period, and then it stops for that subject, and it's really only associated with that instructor or that textbook. And it's not something that endures, that goes on, that's a lifelong process. I've studied literature for a good part of my life, and I used to teach literature at the undergraduate and graduate level. And as you do that, you realize very naturally you do that because you love reading, you love literature, you love writing, but that's a lifelong pursuit. But somehow we try to quantify and codify learning. Well, it's not that way. You're going to take, introduction to British literature and learn that for a semester. And then it's over and you can go on and learn something else. And it's totally kind of cross-purpose and counterintuitive to the way learning actually happens. Learning is about a constant sharing, evaluation, reevaluation, and layering within communities. Communities of practice. When we're interested in things, like Susan and I are a community of practice, and we have other friends that talk about this. And so we've continued to learn throughout the years, even though we're beyond our schooling days, through that community. And that's the way I believe learning should be designed, and that's the way we should be doing courses and doing other designs that we have.
Now that brings up a good point, that as we go through school, in so many cases, there aren't that many teachers like both of you who contage the students to continue to want to learn and to pursue that joy of learning. Life is learning. I've met so many people that were in their 40s or 50s or beyond who say, "I've already learned." Really? You've learned it all, huh? That's pretty good. Can you share some of it? Can you bottle it and sell it? I mean, it's just amazing how few people think, I went through school. I hear this a lot. College grads, I paid my dues. You haven't paid any dues. And they look at you like, well, I went to school 4 years. Good. You haven't learned anything. Now let's start over again. And they look at you with disbelief, but it's sadly true in many cases. Susan and I have this talk about education. How do you get people, we don't want to put out zombies. We want to put out people who can actually work, maybe produce something, or at least have curiosity, or not be harmful.
Well, exactly. And here's the challenge that I'm seeing right now. Yesterday, I spent a day at a joint AAPG, which is Petroleum Geologists, and SPE, which is Petroleum Engineers, event in Oklahoma City. And there was a really good turnout considering the times. We're in crisis times, and there are huge layoffs going on even as we speak. This is like the second or third round. And so I'm Director of Education and Professional Development for an association of petroleum geologists. And we're trying to figure out how to help our members and also just people at large be relevant and retool. And so even if a person says, okay, well, I'm going to be really engaged in college, I like this stuff, that's intrinsic motivation. But then there's also some extrinsic outside when you find that you have to be able to retool yourself to get a job. And one thing I think is quite interesting and flexible, what ties with what Rob and you were both saying, is that all of that has to do with communication and sort of reality checking what's relevant right now that maybe wasn't relevant yesterday.
No, I think that's exactly right, Susan. That relevance is so important. And again, that only comes through dynamic and living community and collaboration. When you treat learning as a static, kind of very time-constrained event, you kind of throw relevance out the window because you're never updating, you're not making it fluid, you're not making it real and responsive to what's happening in the world. And which is one of the reasons, by the way, we look in higher education and there's a backlash, or has been, about learning development skills for software development inside of academia as opposed to learning on your own. Because academia isn't necessarily set up, our programs aren't set up to learn the latest programming languages. Students have to go learn that on their own because that's something that happens so fluidly, the programs can't adapt to it the way they're structured. And we don't build in these community supports around it to make it part of our academic environment. And as a result, it's something that students get a degree, but they have to do all of that learning and education on their own. They find communities to do it with. How wonderful if we could build that in to the actual program itself and make it part of the formal learning experience.
Now you bring up a really good point. Having been a 20-something plus year IT pro, when we went to school, we learned languages like Pascal, which was a very good language to learn logic. We learned other languages like Fortran, which were more scientific, mathematical in nature. I learned APL, which was a very mathematically based language. And then you get into things like COBOL or business languages, BASIC, C++. But you started with foundations, but a lot of the colleges, even back then, and I will age myself, computers, we had no terminals when I started, so it was teletype, so it was very interesting. But you built a foundation, and then when you got out, you had enough knowledge to be able to work off that foundation. Like, for example, once you know one programming language, it's not that difficult to learn another one. If you understand the archetypes, the constructs, it's fairly straightforward. The problem is what I see today, and probably the last 20 years or so, when the students get out, their brains are literally shut. We've dealt with a lot of interns, a lot of college grads throughout the years, and they feel literally, I've done my 4 years, I learned this language, I'm done. And trying to get them to understand that, no, that's a starting point. You still need to get experience. I had 4 years in school. That's not experience. That's sitting in a classroom and maybe a lab. And the problems aren't always reality-based. And so and I've been on some project where we talk to universities and try to give advice. And things in universities, unfortunately, move slowly, kind of like the government, probably maybe not as bad. But it is hard to change curriculums.
Yeah, and I think part of it, the question is, and you make a good point when you talk about foundational languages. I date myself back to data processing and punch cards.
Yep,
but again, you're learning logic, right? And you're learning procedural, the procedural part of programming, which is valid whether you're doing that or trying to do C++, no matter what you're doing, Ruby on Rails, you still have those same basic principles.
Sure.
And I don't sure that you're right, curriculum is slow to evolve. I think it's what we put around the curriculum and the assumptions about what learning is that make a difference. I think, for example, we can add the infusion of make community more a part of it, add the infusion of mentors, add the infusion of outside communities, and really incorporate those into the curriculum. So we're not trying to make the curriculum the thing that has to be learned and somehow that's what's going to make you successful. It's really about developing the skills and the connections with other people. That's what's going to make you successful. And your ability to do that will determine how far you go and how well you're able to integrate into the industry. That's the part that I feel like we've left out.
Now, you brought up a great point in terms of mentors. And I used to think when I was going to college that it should be an apprentice program. where the teacher and you are somewhat close. You work together with that person, and they kind of teach you the ropes. Maybe not every teacher, but definitely at certain levels, that's how you learn. You learn from their experience. And unfortunately, there's a lot of, you get jokes out there that say, those who do and those who can't teach. And I don't think that's fair, because there's a lot of very good teachers who also do. But I've also met a lot of teachers. I'm sorry.
Sure.
Susan?
Oh, no, I totally agree. And I just wanted to jump in here. Sorry to jump in. That the key is collaboration, yes. But then it's how are you collaborating? And if you have a real problem that's situated in the world and it's problem-based learning and you're collaborative and you're doing a team and then you bring team members in, then I think that it's that collective knowledge. So it's difficult for one single mentor to do this, so that this is a way to sort of self-mentor in a distributed way as well.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think you're right, Susan. I totally agree with that. And I think we always want to be careful when we start doing this, right? And you bring up a good point. On the surface, it seems like some pretty easy little adjustments we can make to the way we do traditional and formal education that will fix some things. And of course, we have many startups in America now that kind of are looking at that. I think it's always important to step back and say that managing learning has always been pretty hard. It's not a simple thing. There are a lot of nuances, individual personality issues. There are community. We're human beings after all. And so there are complexities involved. What we're trying to look for is structures that can help us be as successful as we can be. But I think there are a number of things. So I think on the one hand, we have a discussion at the very high level that says, yes, here are the things we need to do to make education work. But as you just pointed out, Susan, it's not just having a mentor. We need communities of mentors. We need to help provide the structures. It's like a system. And that's why I always explain education to people. We all know the second law of thermodynamics, right? We can have a system that has great connections between the different pieces in the system, and they can have all the right channels to making that system successful and help it grow. But without a constant infusion of energy into that system, entropy sets in and things move to stasis. Education is the same way. It's not enough just to provide the right structures. We have to provide an ongoing dynamic energy that gets into that. More than just one mentor, we have to have multiple sources of input to really make that valid and to make it work.
It's funny you bring that. Oh, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I just wanted to tie that back into what you were saying earlier, Rick, about apprenticeship. And that really is a good way to tie it in, because then you have these ongoing projects. And I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think and I agree with what you're saying too, Rob. It's just, we have to be careful about how we design it.
I was thinking, you said something about the second law of thermodynamics, and that brings up something that nobody's really considered recently, and that is that we have a law of unlimited, a fountain of unlimited hot air. That's our government. We could have so many things run by that, but that's I'm digressing. Sorry. Okay. You notice now, Susan, you also said, look at all the layoffs happening in your industry. Have you ever seen a politician lay themselves off? Isn't it just an interesting aside? I'm thinking.
Well,
and by the way, the colleges are under attack by the political groups too, which is sort of interesting, because they want you to conform to certain ways of teaching rather than teaching.
Right. I was at a workshop last week for there's a group here at the University of Oklahoma called the K-20 Center, and they provide professional development and research to high schools and elementary schools, K-12 institutions throughout the state of Oklahoma. And a really talented group of people, but this workshop was for principals and superintendents. And you start thinking about what that job is in America today. And you're a data analyst. You have to analyze multiple inputs of data constantly to make decisions. You're on the hook for all of these pieces of data. You really almost have to be a statistician. And you see all these things that they're doing. They come in with this passion for learning and helping kids, and then it keeps becoming something else, not just because of politicians, but because of the way we misconceive learning. And the art of learning and the heart of learning, I think, really gets kind of pushed away many times. And I think that's one of the dangers of political intrusion into the learning process.
Now, what do you think of the cookie cutter approach to teaching too? Because we try to fit everyone into sort of a cookie cutter from early on, maybe not in the early years, but by about 4th or 5th grade, the cookie cutter goes right into effect. And I'd say we lose a good 50 to 60% of our students at that point.
Of course. I mean, nobody wants to believe or to be treated. I mean, no one, I certainly don't. Any organization I belong to, I want to be an individual with my own individual characteristics and traits, and I want to be treated that way in a company. I've worked in large companies and small companies, and I would say when I moved on, it was often because I didn't feel like I could be appreciated for my own unique giftedness or express that. That starts very young as learners. Learners want to be able to contribute their own giftedness to the learning community. They want to be recognized for that. They don't mind failing, but they want to be recognized for what they do well. And we're so busy trying to measure outcomes many times that we overlook that, and we don't value learners for their individual giftedness. We don't find a way to make that useful within the community, and so they don't feel cared for or really promoted in that sense. And the reality is it's not hard to make learning personal.
No.
Okay, so
it's not hard at all.
Now, it's interesting. Yeah. I went to school in New York growing up a long time ago. And I went to a public school first for about 2-3 years. And then my parents put me in a Catholic school in New York, which was the best school system at that time. And when we graduated, we had 50, and our school was boy and girl, but it was separated. Boys in one building, girls in another one. And there were 50 boys in one class. We all got educated. We all graduated 8th grade with a senior in college reading level. And we're going, wow, how do we do that? But they really catered to reading and we had some lay teachers and some were monks, but they were all very, I would say, engaged with us, from sports to labs. We did science labs. I mean, and I remember that engagement. Not all the teachers were the same way, but the ones that were great really were motivating. And yes. I remember that as we had a chance to be different in a very cookie cutter way, because they did ask for our opinions, if you will, during classes. Why do you think that happened? Do you think you could change that? We're learning science and we're investigating it at the same time, which was fun. So that was, for at least in my case, that's how it happened. And I grew up just loving learning. I didn't like math back then, but that's partly because I had really bad math teachers who I couldn't relate to what we were learning. When I got older, I went, oh, this is beautiful. Just didn't get it back then. So it's just interesting how we perceive things and what we do with what's given to us. Before we go on, let's talk a little bit about NextThought and what you're doing with NextThought.
Yes.
Well, do you mind if I jump in?
No, go ahead.
I mean, okay, yeah. Sorry, I mean, like babbling in the background, but I wanted to. It's my favorite activities, but what I wanted to say is that what I see in NextThought, and I had the opportunity to go to NextThought's offices the day before yesterday and really see what they're doing. And Rick, I loved what you were saying about your experience in your school in New York and the personalization. And I see that as exactly what's being developed in NextThought in the virtual world. And I just was wondering, echoing what you were asking, Rob, can you talk about it?
No, absolutely. So, in a nutshell, NextThought approaches learning in this whole notion of education from what we call a connected learning perspective. And by that, when you think about the way we do learning normally, which I've talked about, we have student belongs to a cohort that goes through a series of courses, et cetera. But it's a real course-centric type of a world. We have so many courses that we take. They're not necessarily connected. We're not connected to the people in those courses per se, but it's all about courses. We envision the world where if you imagine a network of nodes, and you have this group of nodes in a network, and you imagine that the center node, let's say there are 1 million nodes, the center node is the student. We believe that learning is most successful and learning will endure if we can get that student to connect to as many nodes as possible. Each one of those represents another person, a source of information. And so learning is about helping students expand in that network and to grow over time, not just over this 13 or 16 week period or 36-week period, but for the course of their lifetime. So when we look at building a learning platform that's designed primarily, almost exclusively for hybrid and online learning, it really starts with that. It's about making connections, collaborating, et cetera. So I'll give you a couple of examples of that within our platform. And you can see always showing is always better than telling, I think. And so let me go back to the top here and I will start this. So if you look at this example, what you're seeing, we kind of believe in 3 C's. Contextualizing or contextualization, collaboration, and then community. This is part of the contextualization piece. This is a lesson overview, the unit 1 here. But you notice the way it's presented. It shows the unit, but it shows this kind of vertical gravity, but kind of in one clear view, you're contextualized in what you're doing. We think that one of the things that's important is that learners always know what they're supposed to do and why, and there's a normal sequence, but they can get the big picture. We want them to do little things, but we want them always to see the big picture about what's going on so that they feel a part of it, and then they're motivated to reach out and do more and to connect through that network. So if I go into a video, we can start seeing what we mean by collaboration. Normally, when you're learning online, you go through a series of activities. You can watch a video, do a reading, etc. And then to provide some synthesis at the end of all that, we put a discussion activity so everybody can talk to each other. Well, at NextThought, we really believe that that should be happening at every turn, at every piece of content. So in a video, we provide access to transcripts that move along with the video, but we also allow users to create comments and to engage in conversations and discussions at the point of every piece of content. So in this video, you can see here a comment's already been made and you can create it at any time during the video. And if I click on that, I'll see the conversation that's actually been going on around that. So someone has seen something in the video, there's a question that's asked, someone answers that, a conversation happens. And again, this is informal. This isn't something that we created as part of the course saying, now we're going to have a discussion activity. This is taking collaboration into the content itself with a prompt or the expectation just by allowing it to happen. So now discussion and community are building at every point along the way, but it's possible because of the platform. We can do the same thing in just what we would call a standard reading exercise. This could be a textbook. This happens to be a dialogue that one of my colleagues and I created, but we're just presenting text here for people to read. But again, as part of the text, you can see there's discussions. People have added, and notice there were 2 comments made for this particular piece, and they've added there. This icon shows you what actually happens if you moused over. You would have the icon to open up the ability to create one of these. And again, we see people have started, somebody's responded to this comment, 2 people have responded to this comment, and if we click on one of these, the same thing happens. Now, again, I'm having a dialogue. It's in the context of the content itself, which is really valuable, because I'm not having a discussion or a conversation somewhere later on in the course, but I don't remember what it was we were talking about. I don't have to go back and read it. It happens right here at the point that I have a need, where I have the visceral desire to engage with people, and people are here right now ready to have that conversation with me.
Now, Rob, question. Do people in these conversations then kind of digress and go off into other pathways?
They can, and they kind of go every which direction, Rick. And there are a couple of ways. So if it's usually around a specific item, and sometimes, let's say it's an information item, which is a good example, or it's a specific question here that actually was posted as part of the reading, it usually stays on track a little more. If it's something that's around an opinion, what do you think about this? Or in a reading, there's an item that would generate some discussion, it can go on and go in different directions. One of the interesting things about our platform, I didn't show an example here, we're just having text, but learners can also, or participants can also post video or images, etc., like a regular blog post. So the discussions can become not just, here's my opinion, but also bringing in other evidence or other things that they've done or actual artifacts that actually make the conversation richer. And those will also stimulate the conversation taking off in different directions.
I like that.
Now,
I also like the squiggles.
Yeah, we bring this full circle with something that's rather unique to our platform, and that is the notion of a community. So if you think again about a normal course that has a community cohort, a course cohort with it, we could call that a community. Our platform certainly supports that. But we also have this concept of a community that exists outside of the course. So in this community that was part of that course, everybody who participated in the course could be part of the community. But we also had people participating in the community who were from the outside. They were practitioners who didn't really want to go through the course, but they wanted to be involved in communication around the topic, and they wanted to take advantage of resources that we might be creating or examples on student engagement or course design, but they didn't have interest in the course. So they could see what people were posting, they could post new content, add resources, do all of these things, but they're not really part of the course, but they can engage with the course. So in our platform, I'll give you one example to kind of see how this goes. We have a charter school that we're working with. And that charter school is in the south side of Oklahoma City, and it's Santa Fe South Charter School. I'll go ahead and give them props. They work in an area we basically call the block, which is the heaviest crime area in the state of Oklahoma. And they've made tremendous inroads with their students, many of them non-English speaking students when they come. They're Spanish preference students. And so we've got language issues, we have crime issues, all those things that go in, poverty issues, and yet they've been successful. When we asked them, why have you been successful, they were quick to say, because we identified these communities that have to provide support to the students. It's parents, it's potential employers, it's faith-based institutions. With our platform, we're helping them develop a curriculum that not only has the regular, we're doing a developmental math program with them right now, not only helps the students go through the regular math program, but that can integrate those communities as part of the course or connect it to the course, so that at certain points, parents or potential employers could actually participate in a discussion or comment on a project, etc., and they can connect and learn from each other and connecting. So if you think about that grid again, and again you can see how this is all contextualized. If you think about that network again and all those nodes, our platform is allowing us to not only to help them connect to different nodes within the network that they can imagine, but we can create these communities around that they can connect to as well. And it's an exciting frontier for us, to be quite honest, because it's something that is that others don't do. So it's really new. And we're still figuring out all the ways to take advantage of it and provide analytics around it. But it really brings an entirely different option to learning design, because all of a sudden we're really looking at new ways of helping learners connect to each other, to design programs. So if you're designing a master's degree program or just a regular cohort program in any discipline, why not bring in professionals from that program as a community that can participate in discussions with students? Mm-hmm. Why not bring in past graduates or alumni? Why not and the community lives on after the course. So the course isn't ever really done. We build in from the beginning this design that learning is something that's about making connections, and those connections keep going on, and you can have access to those well after you actually took that course, and you can have access to those same conversations, and they live on. And that's what's exciting about NextThought. I think that's the core of what we do, that's kind of bringing a different kind of take on it. And it's something that we're passionate about, and we tend to find our clients as by just simple affinity, right? People who understand that community and collaboration are a different way of kind of infusing this force into learning, and that want to do it but don't really have the tools to. And so we're at the edge of that universe, exploring together.
Now, does this work obviously in universities, but also or schools, but also in the corporate world?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a great question and point, Rick. It's really designed, and if you go back to the early 90s and the work of Wenger and Lave around communities of practice in the education space and thinking about pedagogy, their work and thinking about how communities work in education, their work was really about professional communities of practice, which are exactly what happens in the corporate world. So absolutely. The work we're doing with the K-20 Center here at the University of Oklahoma is about, it's not corporate, but it's similar. It's about principals and superintendents. We had projects that we've worked on with medical training for medical devices and sales training for medical devices, again, where we have surgeons in a community with salespeople trying to figure things out. But it works well because there's an obvious desire and motivation for dialogue, for connecting, for being in community, for continuing to learn and do all of those things. And our platform facilitates that. So absolutely, it's ideal for that.
That's good.
I see that perfectly for what I'm interested in are things like micro competencies. So you can show a competency in what I like to think of as a verified learning experience. And that all hinges upon having an expert and maintaining a relationship or a conversation with some experts. And it kind of ties together what Rick was talking about, apprenticeship, and also what you're talking about, communities of practice and the early theories. So my question is, in NextThought, how can you show competencies? Where's the assessment element?
That's a great question, Susan. Well, we have all of the traditional assessment pieces, right? So think of quizzes, exams, and those types of things. We also, again, are tracking analytics around those connections. So what is a student doing? Not just how are they performing on a quiz, but how are they connecting with other people? Are they starting conversations? Are they participating in conversations around content, et cetera? So we have a number of ways to look at student behavior, how they're growing in that network. So depending on how you want to measure competency around very formal summative assessment or participatory growth in making connections in their professional network, those are all things that we certainly track and can look at as we look at measuring competencies. I think the other thing we look at in a model like that is we would think about taking learners or participants through a series of competencies. Think of those as kind of micro courses, etc., that they could take, prove competency in. But at the same time, instead of those competencies being kind of isolated or just kind of put together in a catalog, those are buttressed with communities that exist beyond those. So the students aren't required to only have community if they're working individually with some class cohort and everybody's working at different paces, so that doesn't really work. But we build overarching communities around those competencies, so there's always experts, there's mentors, there are other learners at different places along the way that they connect with that really kind of provide some foundational strength to that competency-based learning.
That's great. Now, Susan, now you realize we are in California, so we specialize in micro incompetencies. That's a whole other world.
Terrible. You know what? I have a question for both of you. Okay, but first for Rob. Rob, who is your favorite Argentine author? And then the question is, where did you both spend time in Argentina?
And we have that in common.
Yeah, exactly. So, this is a strange one. I don't know if I go to a single favorite author. They went through different periods of time. My background, my PhD was originally in Spanish, but with an emphasis in Latin American literature. That's what I studied, and my dissertation was an Argentine crime novel in the military government of the 70s, and so in the formative years before that, so you had the great writers like Cortázar or Sábato, the novelists, and of course Borges, who influenced all of the whole generations that came after him. So Cortázar was an early favorite. I fell in love with some of the writers of that generation, lesser known writers like Mempo Giardinelli, who was from like the Chaco region, but probably over time, even though Cortázar he lived in exile in Paris for so long, would have probably been one of my favorite authors, I think, even though a little dated. I think classics never go completely out of style.
And I was born in Argentina, but we migrated here when I was 3 years old. That was in 1957, so it's been a long time. But I did go back during that 3 years, from 77 to 1980, so I know the period you were talking about very well. I lived it. Interesting time to go back, actually. But and I think I was the same. I didn't read that much Argentine literature. I did read Sábato and Borges. Those were the two I remember. And other than that, I think I didn't read that much, at least Spanish or Argentine literature. I think sadly, when I was going to elementary and high school, they killed my love of literature pretty horribly with some of the books we had to read and the context that they weren't in. Though some were very good, but that was, I loved reading. I was one of those science fiction fans. I read everything and anything science fiction. So I know where Susan wants to go.
Yeah. So Rick,
yes.
When you went back, were you in Buenos Aires or?
I was in Buenos Aires.
Okay. Yeah. So Susan, to answer your question, when I lived there in '84, okay. And that was right after the first year of the democracy, after the military government. Mm-hmm. And I lived in the south side of Buenos Aires, okay. in a little neighborhood called what am I thinking of now? All I can think of is Adrogué. I was right next to Adrogué, but anyway.
Adrogué.
Between Banfield and Adrogué, and now I can't even remember.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. That's the one area I didn't know that well, which was the southern part. I knew the northern part, the downtown area, and then as it went west.
And so I was interesting, though. I lived in the southern part because I knew some people who were from there and had some contacts, but I actually commuted to La Plata for my work there.
Okay.
Because I went to the university there.
Yes.
And then I went back on both on student trips and over the summers. Again in the 90s, I spent several summers there, and both of those times I lived more in the central area near like Parque Once and in that area of town.
I lived very close to Once. I lived on Rivadavia, which is right on the edge of Once, but I lived in Primera Junta, which was Caballito. Those are the areas kind of heading towards the west. I could walk to downtown in 90 minutes, just a nice, pleasant walk. I did that many times. I worked at Citibank just downtown, and I worked at Berlitz teaching English. That was interesting. And that's how I got my Citibank job. And it was a lot of fun. I miss the food. That's the one thing I do miss. I love the food down there.
Oh, yeah. A la parrilla.
La parrilla. Yeah.
La parrilla. A la
Milanesas.
parrilla. Yeah,
So it was a lot of fun. And I learned a lot about different society. The culture is very different there from here. And
very different.
In some ways better, in some ways worse, but it is different.
It's very different. And Rick, you can imagine what I was living on the other end of that at that first year of democracy, when I was going to the university with students in the first full year of a university life where there hadn't been a military government and any kind of repression, where students could start voting on everything, like whether to go to class or not, or and have marches without retaliation. And it was such a really alive, vibrant time in the life of the university life of the country. I went to a march in downtown Buenos Aires near the Casa Rosada. There were over 500,000 students marching. It was just amazing. I mean, we can't imagine. It seems impossible to ever happen in this country.
Not
this
anymore.
idea of the freedom of being able to express yourself was amazing. It was really exhilarating, and people rediscovering culture in so many ways. I mean, if you think about what we take for granted in this country when we think of places like Argentina in particular, like the tango and Argentine music. Well, during the 70s in particular, there was, in the military government, tango as we know it was really downplayed in so many ways. It was this national form. We kind of wanted to control all of that. Well, the tango had this incredible rebirth all of a sudden in the 80s and 90s, and now we can, it continued to explode worldwide. But all of those forms were all of a sudden being rediscovered. It was a really rich time, and as I've gone back over the years, it's always been great. But yeah, Buenos Aires is such an incredible city. Rick, your point about being able to walk.
I love that.
We lived near Once, just be able to really walk all the way downtown.
I averaged about 100 blocks a day on a daily basis. I was skinny then. I really enjoyed it. It was a very nice place to live. Though, again, I've had machine guns put in my stomach and stuff like that. So that part wasn't so much fun. But that was the nature of the government at the time. And I understood why the government happened. The problem is, like all, Machiavellian ideas, absolute power corrupts absolutely. They started with a good intention, and then it went down the tubes.
Yes. Well, that's interesting I was thinking about when you're talking about tango, remember Boquitas Pintadas by Manuel Puig? That was like a novel that was an epistolary novel that talked a lot about sort of tango was at the heart of it. And I think a lot of the novels seem to incorporate that. And then, let's see, so many.
The tango really comes from France. It was the Apache. And it was a French dance. It was a rather violent dance, actually. Women get really wiped out on that thing. They get thrown around and everything. So the tango was a more moderate version of it. But the footwork was very active, and it's pretty nice watching. But it was very different in the original version.
And the music, of course, comes from is really from the bandoneon, which is the principal instrument, which is a German instrument made by Bond about the same time the accordion appeared. Yep. And it was meant, interesting enough, as an instrument that could be carried to funeral dirges, things you do outside, or for processionals where you couldn't have an organ. So it was meant to replace, or if you're a very poor village, to replace that ability to have an organ. It's a very Astor Piazzolla, who's probably the greatest composer of tango, always when you hear him describe it. In fact, Rick, he shares that with you. His family moved to New York when he was young.
Interesting.
They were Argentine, and he was learned to play the bandoneon, went back to Argentina, and of course became the greatest national composer, but spent a good bit of his life in New York. And
that's interesting. My dad always talked about him. I don't know if he ever met him. He knew quite a few people from Argentina. He knew the other guy, Lalo Schifrin, who, if you remember, Mission Impossible theme, among hundreds of others, but he was famous for that one. He grew up and played soccer football with my uncle, and they were all friends. So it's really interesting. And he was, fantastic. I think he was Egyptian Argentine, kind of the Egyptian descent, if I'm not wrong.
I think that's right.
Very nice guy. I met him briefly once on an airplane flight heading back to Argentina. So it was interesting.
Do you like, this is speaking of crime novels, do you like Roberto Bolaño? It's not Argentine, it's Chilean, writing about Mexico, living in Mexico, but Detectives Salvajes is incredible. But I all that noir energy, I can just feel it. And I've only been to Buenos Aires once, but it sort of immediately encased it in this like noir context in Torino, and I liked it. It was just so great. And it would be so cool to blend a crime novel with science fiction.
Well, Argentina has a light history of science fiction writers, but Elena Goroischer in the 60s was also one of the female novelists. There weren't that many of them. Did had her hand at science fiction, and so she was well known there. But the noir was really interesting. That came in because it was influenced, interesting enough, by early detective writing, classic detective writing. Certainly Borges was influenced by that, but like Poe. But it didn't come from English translations from America. It came from French translations from the native English from America, came in French translations from Paris. A lot, which was interesting. A lot of North American literature came in French as translation. But so Poe and others, and then later Agatha Christie, but the noir that grew out of that detective fiction, as it did in other places, from hard-boiled into true crime novels, really grew out of the political instability and the change. And in the 70s, a lot of traditional authors, everybody from Manuel Puig to Giardinelli to there were so many that did it. Osvaldo Soriano, Juan Carlos Martini, and Jose Pablo Feynman. They all were doing this as a way of using popular literature to kind of get through censorship.
That's true.
You're telling a crime novel, right? So that can't be anything that's criticizing the government. And yet everybody's driving around in these unmarked Ford Falcons, which was code for paramilitary. And so you had all of these things going on that were very anti-government. I mean, it was some of the most blatantly anti-government protest of government violence.
And nobody got it.
Insanity of how they were rewriting history. That was what they were all about. And yet they passed through censorship.
Yeah. There was a magazine I used to read called Humor Registrado, I guess humor registered or registered humor. And they constantly did parodies. They had one called La Vida Interior, the interior life or the internal life, which is all about the bacteria in our body. And now you had military-like bacteria who tried to dominate the non-military-like bacteria. And they got right through it. They occasionally got censored, like one issue would disappear every so often, and then it come back. It's like nobody got it. And it was a great parody. So, yeah, that was the good old days. And yet, surprisingly enough, it was probably one of the safest cities in the world to walk during that time. Nothing would really happen to you. And for women, extremely safe. Rape really didn't occur back then.
Well, it's one of the advantages of military dictatorships is in having beefed up police, a little less due process, and so it kind of keeps crime off the streets. And I used to tell that to people. It's hard to understand because we would be horrified at that in the States, right?
Right.
And yet, when we moved there, I could let my wife. If my wife decided she wanted to go downtown at 2 a.m. in a city of 12 million people, I never would have thought about it.
No. 2 a.m. was when you started going out for some people. It was not. It was a 24-hour city.
Yeah.
So it was a lot of fun. I do miss my time there.
So I have hopes of going back, maybe moving back someday. You never can tell.
Yeah.
That would be so amazing.
Yeah, it's I think we've all had this experience where you identified with another culture and you've realized you were living in this bifurcated universes, right? And you were equally at home in one as in the other. And that was one for me that I found early on, and I felt there was no way that I did not feel completely at home there, as if I'd grown up there and lived there all my life.
And what I find interesting is, having lived under a military dictatorship and coming back here and watching us lose our rights day in after day in after day in, and nobody even has a clue.
Yes.
I just go, wow, if you only knew.
Yes.
And I'd say we have less rights here than we did down there right now at this moment. We disappear differently here.
Yes.
I think here we have accidents. A little scary sometimes.
Yes, but it's interesting. I went back and forth to Paraguay, which had the world's longest live dictatorship, and I would hear people talking about, well, things were safer and more orderly back during our dictatorship. Not that they really wanted to go back to that, but they did talk about benefits of.
Well, order. Paraguay had, I think, was it Stroessner?
Yes.
Yes, I mean, kind of related to the old Nazi regimes. I mean, there was all sorts of good things going on in Paraguay. I think that's where Mengele was, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think that's where they got. It wasn't Bolivia. I think it was in Paraguay. I may be wrong.
I thought it was Brazil. Let's say Brazil.
Oh, you're thinking of the novel, The Boys from Brazil.
Yeah, probably. No, I think you're right.
Adolf Eichmann was in Argentina.
Yeah, they found him, I think, in the interior.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, guys, we are at the end of our time. We've actually exceeded our time by quite a bit. But, Rob, it's been a pleasure meeting you today. And if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to contact you?
They can always send me a personal email at rob.reynolds@nextthought.com, but they can go to our website and send just an email through the contact, and that will get to me.
Sounds great. And I think we have the website up right now. Okay. And Susan, we can contact you on Mars, so we know what the post office box is there. We should be good.
Yes.
SpaceX, she may make it there one day. You never know.
You never know.
Just call me Martian.
Call you Martian. Greenie. We'll call you Greenie. How's that?
I like it. It works.
It works. Well, if you are watching the show on YouTube, please subscribe and give us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And Rob, again, thanks for being on today. We appreciate it. Susan, as always.
Thank you so much.
We will see you guys next week. Have a good one, everyone.
Right.
Well, actually, no, next week we are dark. I won't be around. I'll be a DevLearn.
That's right.
So
you will be.
We will see you the week after.
Yes, absolutely.
Have a good one, everyone. Take care.
Right.
Bye-bye.
See y'all later.
Bye.